Hi, happy Autistic Pride to you all, and welcome to this presentation from Neurodivergent Labour. My name's Janine Booth, I'm the chair of ND Labour, and I'm going to talk you through some stuff about us. So, what am I going to tell you about Neurodivergent Labour? I'm going to tell you who we are, our manifesto, I'm going to tell you about our activities, and about how you can get involved. So, who are we? First of all, we have to start with what is neurodivergence, which may well not be news to some of you, but I don't want to take anything for granted, so there you go. Humanity is neurologically diverse. It consists of individuals who have different brain wiring or structure from each other. And neurological differences include autism, attention deficit disorders, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and many more. So what does that mean Neurodivergent Labour is? Well, we are a representative and campaigning organisation of Labour Party members and supporters who are neurologically divergent. We were founded in 2019. This is our founding meeting with lots of people voting to set up ND Labour, and also voting to adopt these as its core aims. We aim to develop socialist policy on neurological diversity, to win support for Labour among neurodivergent people and their supporters, to campaign against discrimination, exclusion, oppression and injustice, and for equality for neurodivergent people, to provide support to neurodivergent Labour Party members who are experiencing discrimination. We aim to work to make the Labour Party more accessible to its neurodiverse membership, to work towards a social model of neurodiversity, about which more shortly, to empower, provide agency, voice and representation of and by neurodivergent people in the Labour Party, in public office and in society, and to maintain, develop and promote a manifesto. We have a couple of patrons who it's sort of an honorary position, I suppose, but it's also, they do also actively campaign for us, and in particular we chose two Labour MPs who consistently raise our issues in Parliament, and that's John McDonnell MP and Nadia Whittome MP. We went for either end of the age and experience scale, with John, who's been a lifelong socialist and has supported neurodivergent Labour for many years and taken up autism issues for many years, and Nadia Whittome MP, who is the youngest MP in the House of Commons, and I think she's 23 now, and has taken up our issues with some gusto. Okay, so that manifesto we were talking about. Oh look, there's the legendary Chris Packham holding a copy of our manifesto, which he has given his endorsement to. We actually had the manifesto before we even had Neurodivergent Labour. The manifesto came first, and then ND Labour came after that. And I think we kind of like to think of that as the saying goes, putting the horse before the cart, because it was important to us that the policies and the politics came first, and the organisation comes next and is there to fight for these policies. So why have a manifesto? Because autistic and other neurodivergent people in our society experience discrimination, distress and disadvantage, and we want some policies to tackle that. So in what ways do we experience that distress, that discrimination, that disadvantage? In diagnosis, or as a lot of us prefer to call it, identification, because, you know, diseases are diagnosed, aren't they? Autism is not a disease. Waiting lists for assessments, for diagnostic assessments, really vary, and they're very long in some parts of the country. And also the process is problematic as well. Independent living. It can be a struggle for autistic people to live independently, partly because services have been cut, partly because housing is difficult to get, partly because of the benefit system is very punitive, partly simply because of the distress that we're often caused living in our society. In education, there's a great deal of discrimination. Just oh, you could do a whole separate presentation just on this, although we're not going to. But for example, autistic kids are way overrepresented in the numbers of kids who are excluded from school. To be honest, I hate to see any kid excluded from school. But what's happening with autistic kids is they get wound up and wound up and wound up for months and months and months, whether it's by the sensory environment or by bullying or by frustration or lack of support or whatever. And then they finally crack and have a meltdown, and it's them that gets excluded for it, and that isn't fair. In the world of work, it's the statistic has been 15 or 16% for a few years of autistic people who are in full-time employment. Although recent figures from the Office for National Statistics show that that may have got worse. But it's one of the lowest employment records of any what the statistics would call disability group. And I don't believe for one moment that that's because only 15 or 16% of autistic adults are capable of working full-time. I think it's because jobs and work are organised in a way that is hostile and excluding to us. Prejudice and discrimination. I'm sure I don't need to tell people watching this the levels of prejudice and discrimination that autistic and other neurodivergent people can face. And the justice system, which I'll say a bit more about in a bit, is it places us at a great disadvantage navigating our way through it, whether we're in trouble with the law or whether we're a victim of a crime. So when we drew up our manifesto, we considered 5 key principles to underlie the policies. The social model of disability. So the social model of disability says, look, an individual might have an impairment or a condition, but what you're disabled by is barriers in society that obstruct our ability to take part and live equally and independently. The neurodiversity approach, in other words, the acceptance that humanity is neurologically diverse, that it consists of different individuals with different brain wirings or structures, and that's good, and that is not something that humanity should seek to eliminate. It's something that society should seek to embrace. Opposing austerity. I've mentioned earlier that cuts to the services that we and other neurodivergent people rely on have taken a terrible toll on people, particularly over the last 13 years since the 2008 crash. And we're anti-austerity. We're against that. We want public resources used to protect and provide for members of the public, which includes us. Socialism, democracy and solidarity. So this is very much a Labour autism and neurodiversity manifesto. It's not a manifesto that we're asking all political parties to support or that we'd expect any other political party to support, because it is based on our core beliefs of socialism, of wanting a socialist society, a democratic society, and of workers' solidarity and human solidarity as a way of achieving that. And finally, the principle of nothing about us without us. I'm sure we're all very well aware that lots of people talk about autistic people. Lots of people talk over autistic people. Lots of people talk instead of autistic people. So our manifesto and our campaigns and actions are very much based around us leading our own campaigns. Of course, we welcome the support of allies. Of course we do. But we need to be in the forefront of raising our issues and explaining what they are. Okay, so what are the policies then? On diagnosis, we want it to be available to everyone without delays. We want it to recognise neurodivergence in girls and women as well as in boys and men, which is not currently adequately done. We want assessment of related conditions as well. It's very common for someone who's got one neurodivergent condition to maybe have another one, or maybe have another physical or mental condition as well, and we need that to be assessed. And we want adequate support after diagnosis. I don't know about any of you watching here, but when I was diagnosed as autistic, which is at the age of 45, I said, oh, well, thanks for that. It was good news. What support services are there? And they said, oh no, we don't have any of them. We just thought you'd like to know. But people do need proper support after diagnosis. On independent living, we want the cuts in public services to be stopped and reversed. We want local council autism forums to include autistic representatives, and we're quite specific about what we mean by that, because since the Autism Act, local councils have been required to have what they sometimes call a committee or a partnership board or a forum or something like that, and they have autistic people on them, but what often they will have is a big majority of professionals and then one or two autistic people who've been kind of handpicked by the council to be token autistic members of this body. And we don't want that. We want a large block of autistic people on those committees, and we want them to be elected by the local autistic people and to include a diversity of autistic people with different needs and different experiences. In the health and social care system, we need the NHS restored, i.e. properly funded, and the privatisation of bits of the NHS undone so it becomes a unified public well-resourced service. We want care provision to be close to home, family and support networks. One of the most unjust and tragic things, bad things that's been happening to autistic people of late is that the social care system is in such a bad way that if you do need social care, and if you do need residential social care, it can be very hard to get a place. And even if you do, you can sometimes find that it's miles and miles away, even hundreds of miles away from your family home, from people who support you, from your support networks and friends. And that has had tragic, indeed fatal consequences in some cases. So that has to change. We want suitable work or decent benefits for all. So yeah, some of us can work, some of us can't. If we can, let's have jobs that are accessible to us, and if we can't, let's have a decent standard of living anyway. Okay, in the education system, we want school workers' core training to include neurodiversity. We want provision for neurodivergent students in early years and at all schools, colleges and universities. We want varied teaching and assessment methods. Unfortunately, the education system has been going backwards in this respect over recent years. The kind of the Michael Gove School of Education and Assessment, where exams are everything. And some people, often due to their neurotype, are never going to be able to show their best of their ability in exams. And we want education about neurodiversity in the curriculum so everyone is learning to accept the fact that different people think differently. In the world of work, we want there to be a legal requirement to make working conditions less hostile. So rather than have a work capability assessment, which has caused a great deal of distress to a great many benefit claimants, why not instead have a workplace accessibility assessment? And then instead of checking whether people are fit to work, you're checking whether workplaces are fit for people to live in. We want job applications to be accessible and non-discriminatory. I'm sure a lot of us are quite sick of seeing the sort of job advert that might say friendly, outgoing team player required for job as computer programmer. Okay, so why do you need to be a friendly, outgoing team player to be a computer programmer? Really don't think that you do. So what that employer has done there is set up an irrelevant and unnecessary personality filter to keep out people who they think won't fit in, which means that people who could be very good computer programmers, and I know it's a terrible stereotype to say that's autistic people, but if you were an autistic person who's good at computer programming, you might not even bother applying for that job because you think you're not a friendly, outgoing team player. We want anti-discrimination law to cover volunteers as well as employees. At the moment, it doesn't, and we're aware of at least one charity which has a blanket rule, or had a blanket rule, of no autistic volunteers, and that is lawful, and it's lawful because the Equality Act doesn't cover volunteering. And we want support for self-employed neurodivergent people. If you end up working for yourself because that suits you better than working for a boss, then you might need support in getting that up and running and dealing with all the bureaucracy, etc., that comes with it. Okay, in the area of prejudice and discrimination, we want to see the application of universal design, which is a strategy for making the built environment less distressing and more accessible for everybody. We want a strategy to be applied to tackle bullying and hate crime. We want to make neurological status or neurotype or neurodivergence a protected characteristic under the Equality Act, which means we, autistic and other neurodivergent people, would be protected legally from discrimination in a way that we are not adequately at the moment. And we want to regulate, we want the government to regulate treatments offered to autistic people and to ban those that are found to be dangerous, quack attempts at curing us. Okay, in the justice and legal system, we want to make the justice system accessible to people of all neurologies. We want the legal system to stop criminalising non-harmful, unusual behaviours. Lots of us like to behave in a way that society considers unusual, some of our types of stimming, for instance. And unfortunately, sometimes people get nicked for it. And if something isn't harmful, it shouldn't be criminalised. We want support and rehabilitation for offenders with ADHD and other neurodivergent conditions. Research shows that a huge proportion of prisoners meet the diagnostic criteria for ADHD, in particular for other neurodivergent conditions as well, and they need specific support and with rehabilitation. And we want to recognise the law to recognise that hate crime can be aimed at neurodivergent people. And in terms of improving understanding, we want public education about neurodiversity at all levels, with a campaign to raise public awareness of neurodiversity, and more resources for research guided by the needs and concerns of neurodivergent people. And that second half of that is really important, because we don't want research guided by the needs and concerns of pharmaceutical companies who want to invent medicines to make us less autistic, or research guided by the needs and concerns of people who want to exploit us. We want it guided by us and what information and understanding we think can be mobilised to benefit us. Okay, so that was our manifesto, and the good news was that in 2019, and you can see the quote there from John McDonnell, Labour in that general election promised that if elected, it would implement the manifesto in full, because it recognises that it's a groundbreaking document with some radical yet practical policies that can transform people's lives. The bad news, of course, is that Labour didn't win the 2019 manifesto election, so the manifesto isn't on the cusp of being implemented, but that is something we are hoping to change. And in any case, our manifesto is something that we fight for in between elections as well as at elections, which leads neatly on to the next bit, which is what we do, our Neurodivergent Labour, our activities. Okay, we do a lot of campaigning for justice. Already mentioned the disadvantage in the justice system that many autistic people face. So I'm going to mention this chap who we were out protesting in support of last weekend. He's called Osim Brown. He's 22. He's autistic. He has some mental health and physical health conditions as well. And Osim moved to Britain with his family from Jamaica when he was 4 years old. He's never been back to Jamaica. He doesn't know anybody there. He wasn't diagnosed or identified during his childhood, so he wasn't given the support he needed, and his life got a bit rocky, and he ended up being sent to prison for not stealing a mobile phone. What do you mean by that? There's a law in Britain called joint enterprise, which means you can be convicted of a crime even if you didn't do it, just because you were there. And Osim was there when someone else stole a mobile phone, and even though witnesses told the court that he told them not to steal the phone, he was convicted anyway, and he was sent to prison. And he's since been released, but because he was sent to prison under Britain's immigration laws, he's automatically served with a deportation order. So he now lives under daily threat of being seized by immigration, put on a plane and deported to Jamaica, a place where he knows nobody, where there's no support system for people like him, and to be kicked out by a system that failed him in the first place, that didn't provide him with the support he needed, and now threatens to do something which would do unspeakable harm to him. So Neurodivergent Labour is part of a major campaign to support Osim. I really hope that by the time you're listening to this, we're able to tell you that the Home Office has seen the error of its ways, because it is due to make a decision on his legal appeal in between when I'm recording this and when you're going to be watching it. But hopefully that will go the right way. If it goes the wrong way, we will carry on campaigning. We already have signatures of over 400,000 people on the petition to support Osim. And if your name is not already on that, please sign it. I think his case encapsulates, it's a very, we support him for basic humanitarian reasons. We don't want this terrible thing to happen to this vulnerable young man. But also it encapsulates the intersection of neurodivergence and race as issues, as characteristics which disadvantage people in our legal system, and that's something we want to challenge. So we've been taking up the issue of justice more widely as well, and earlier this year the Ministry of Justice asked for submissions of evidence into, because it's doing some work on neurodiversity in the justice system, and Neurodivergent Labour submitted a big document of evidence with input from our members, and we called for lots of things, including more support for neurodivergent people in the justice system, venues such as courts and interview rooms to have a benign sensory environment, restoration of legal aid, printed materials and dyslexia-friendly layout, and interviews to be straightforward and non-aggressive, and lots of other things. If you want to read that document, you can read it in full on our website. Address coming up later. Okay, we've been campaigning quite a lot on social care. So there have been, sadly, numerous stories over recent years of abuse taking place in social care, and we have highlighted and campaigned on that. At the beginning of the COVID pandemic, the Coronavirus Act enabled councils to stop providing social care for autistic, neurodivergent and otherwise disabled people. We campaigned against that alongside other organisations, and I'm glad to say that a few weeks ago the government announced that it was going to drop that and again require local councils to provide social care, and that was undoubtedly as a result of the pressure that had been put on them by various campaigning groups. We run education events. So just before the recent local elections, we ran an online podcast on what neurodivergent people need from our local councils, and we had a great array of speakers. So we had from left to right of the pictures there, Gethin Jones, who was a Labour candidate for the Senedd, the Welsh Assembly, and who works in the prison service, Nikki Hughes, who is Romani and spoke about issues for autistic people in the Gypsy Romani Traveller GRT communities, John McDonnell MP, Joan Martin, who is Osim Brown's mum, and Andrew Berry, who is a local government trade unionist. You can watch the whole of that podcast, the questions and answers, on our YouTube channel, and read a transcript of the opening contributions on our website. We respond to political happenings. So, for instance, these are just some examples. A year and a bit ago, there was a report of a rise in mumps cases. This was just before the pandemic kicked in and everyone started worrying about another rather more urgent health issue. But the reason there was a rise in mumps cases was because a generation ago, a whole bunch of parents didn't vaccinate their children against it because of a unscientific, groundless panic about autism. So we responded to that. When Oliver Letwin, who was a leading Tory, said that we need security in Britain in case some autistic person tries to sabotage the public infrastructure. We spoke out against that bigoted comment. And when the coronavirus came along and lockdown started, we worked with the Safe and Equal campaign to demand full sick and isolation pay for all. As I'm sure you all know, one of the hotbeds for coronavirus infection and death, tragically, was in care homes. And part of the reason for that, but also part of the reason for the transmission, one of the vectors of transmission of the virus around the place, was the fact that lots of workers don't get full sick or isolation pay. So when you think you might have COVID, some people can be faced with the choice of either going to work and putting themselves at risk, or staying at home and not being able to pay the rent at the end of the week. So what we need, and what we need ongoing beyond the pandemic as well, as a general public health measure, is full sick and isolation pay for all. And recently we had the May 2021 Queen's speech, and we commented on that, about its failure to reverse underfunding of social care, its prevarication over banning conversion therapies, and its announcement of compulsory voter identification, which we think will lead to fewer neurodivergent people exercising their right to vote, because it places a further barrier in the way of our democratic rights. And there's days and weeks and months for everything now, isn't there? And we do like to comment on most of them. So there you go, on UN Day for the elimination of racism, we highlighted Oisin Brown's case, and we made a clear statement against racism. On Holocaust Memorial Day, we extended our solidarity to all the groups that were persecuted by the Nazis, and highlighted that autistic and other neurodivergent people were murdered by the Nazis, as well as other groups. Learning Disability Week, we issued some material and did some campaigning around the rights of neurodivergent people who also have learning disabilities. And most recently, in Mental Health Awareness Day last month, we issued some material to stress that it is not our autism that makes us mentally unwell. It's the pressures put on us by society that can stress us out. Okay, so last bit now, how you can get involved. We have democratic structures. So if you are a Labour Party member and you're neurodivergent, you can join. If you're waged, it's a tenner a year. If you're unwaged, it's free. Organisations can affiliate. So we've got some trade unions affiliating. We've got some constituency Labour parties affiliating. We have an annual general meeting every year which votes on policy and that all members can attend. And we have an elected executive committee that carries stuff out during the year, including stuff you can get involved in. And our members have the right, and some of them are working on it right now, to set up local and workplace groups. So you can have a neurodivergent Labour group in your town, or a neurodivergent Labour group for people who work in your industry, for instance. And we have a working group on increasing Black and ethnic minority involvement, and hopefully we'll have some working groups on some other stuff too. Okay, we have events and campaigns, so look out for our events and come to our events. That picture is of one of our fringe meetings at Labour Party Conference. We hold a fringe meeting every year at Labour Party Conference. We hold other events too. Please support and join in our campaigns. I'm again going to mention Oisin Brown because it's such an important campaign. There are lots of campaigns we're involved in that we'd like to see you get involved in too. And finally, you can invite us to speak. Or, I mean, you might have watched this and think, oh, I agree with everything they say. They sound brilliant. I'll invite them to speak at my event I'm having next month. That would be excellent. Or you might have watched it and thought, what a load of rubbish. But even if you thought, what a load of rubbish, then invite us to speak anyway and have a debate. Okay? Just because we're all autistic doesn't mean we all agree. Honestly, no, we're as different from each other as we are from everybody else. So, but we're only going to take our demands and our struggle for a better future, we're only going to be able to take that forward if we argue out our understanding of it and talk about what kind of policies we need to address it. So invite us along to that. And finally, you can find us on the internet. We have a website, ndlabour.co.uk. We're on Facebook, Neurodivergent Labour. We're on Twitter @NeuroLabour. And we're also on YouTube and Instagram, where apparently that's where the young folks hang out, so I'm led to believe. So Thank you very much for watching this presentation on what is neurodivergent labour. This has taken exactly half an hour. I'm very pleased with my timing because that's what I was aiming for. But we're going to have another some more to show you following this and in the future. So solidarity to you all, and bye-bye.
Okay, so hello, my name is Han Sutcliffe, they, them pronouns, and I'm the Manifesto Officer of Neurodivergent Labour.
Hi, my name is Nikki Hughes and I'm also they, them, and I am a Romani disabled activist and I'm Vice Treasury of Neurodivergent Labour.
What we want to talk about here today, we want to talk about what challenges autistic people within the Roma, Gypsy and Traveller communities face in regards to accessing autistic support, education support, as well as similarities between the two communities, because sometimes I think we will separate people out into two camps and then assume that they have different needs and then just assume that it's because of what they are. And I think that does a great disservice to both communities, given that we live on the same island and often we don't talk. So, Nikki, first question I think would be, what is the current state that you currently know about? I'm a settled person. I don't know very much. I do live in Newark, which has one of the higher densities of traveller people. And currently there's a lot of legal battles going on regarding land and space. So I can imagine that for autistic people who need that level of settled, of routine, that can be quite stressful, particularly at a young age.
Yeah, so the first thing that I want to point out is that Irish travellers and Romanis are different ethnicities. So in the UK, especially, Romanis like to add gypsy to the end of that. So they'll say Romani gypsy. So they'll say I'm a Romani. European Romani prefer to say Roma or just Romani without the gypsy. So you have Irish travellers, or they also call themselves mincers or pavi, and then you have Romani gypsies, and then you have the European Romani. So even though like UK, we're the same ethnicity in Europe, there's a different culture because I don't think a lot of people realize that with Romani people there are different tribes. So in the UK, the tribe that dominates in the UK is Romachows, and they tend to be also in America and Australia as well. So culturally, within the different tribes, there are differences as how they interact with the world, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
As far as I'm aware, I don't think, but I've been a Romani, I'm not an expert on Irish traveller culture, but I don't think that they have tribes. I think it's one culture. So in the UK, you have Scottish travellers who they're a mix between Irish travellers and Romani travellers, and Romani like gypsies, and then you have the Welsh Cale who are from Romani descent, but their culture is more matriarchal rather than patriarchal. So there's like difference in the UK how the different ethnicities and culture mess, and I think that's what a lot of people struggle to understand in the UK, because I think they hear like gypsy and they just put Romani and Irish people together, and they don't realize that other than nomadicity, there's not much similarity other than the discrimination they face, if that makes sense. So what you tend to find on permanent sites is that you tend to find, and I'm not saying this is a like generalized every single site is like this, but what you tend to find is that one site will be dominated by maybe Irish travellers, and then another permanent site will be dominated by mainly Romani gypsies. And it's just because of the different ways that our cultures work that it's easier for us to be together if we're living together, if that makes sense. So the problem with what's going on with the UK in terms of living condition is that you have that aspect of like Irish travellers wanting to live with Irish travellers, which is fine, and Romani gypsies wanting to live with Romani gypsies, but they'll be like, there isn't enough sites to accommodate either of those two ethnicities. So majoritively, Romani gypsies tend to live in housing now. I think it's like something like over 90% are actually in settled homes. And I think it's for us, because nomadacy is something that was forced upon us, not necessarily cultural. We tend to have found that like through discrimination, Romani people have been forced to move on rather than it is embedded in a culture, although some Romani gypsies still enjoy being nomadic to a certain extent because it's a part of our culture in the sense of the community and living outdoors and cooking outdoors. You know, these things are very important to us culturally, but nomadacy all year round is not necessarily a thing that is like rigid into our culture, if that makes sense.
That makes sense.
Whereas I feel like with like with Irish travel, it's a part of their culture to continue to move around. So what we found in this country, obviously, because there isn't enough space on permanent sites and the pitches up, I mean, you're talking about maybe 15 pitches at the most. It's very, very small, these sites, and there's hardly any of them at all. So those who still want to persist in living a nomadic life are forced to constantly move around and are constantly evicted. So for somebody who's autistic, who needs routine, needs to be more settled, constantly being evicted, like turning up somewhere instantly, the settled community coming out, seeing things online about yourself, then having the police turn up, then having the bailiffs turn up, and seeing, you know, the adults, the males and the females, like arguing, sometimes fighting, do you know what I mean? Police brutality, all of those things are traumatic anyway, but I think for autistic people, that is a whole lot worse. And I think that's why a lot of the time when both ethnicities, Irish travellers and Romani gypsies, are faced with having a disabled child, they make the move to become settled, especially obviously access to the medical world as well is very difficult. Getting signed up with a GP, getting assessments, interventions, therapies, all of those need for you to be settled. So a lot of the time they give up that element to be settled.
And of course, given that these services are so stretched, you can be looking at months, years waiting lists. And for a child, that can mean the very difference, particularly given education stats and how difficult it seems that there's such a wide breadth of people seem to be massively failed by the education system. And can I just say that sounds like an amazing amount of people. It really does. I had no idea that there were so many different ethnicities and so much different cultures. It's truly beautiful. As someone who's part of the Morris tradition, I really appreciate, and I've hung around travellers and many of different tribes myself, because one of the things that Morris people really try to do is engage with the traditional culture of England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland. And it's a real privilege to be engaged with those communities. And this is why I think it's so important to bring these multiple communities together. But given that already autistic people face huge amounts of police brutality, it must be really quite difficult for the various disparate communities to trust a system that has failed them so completely. And given that you have so little sites, which I know from experience are often underserviced, no water, no electricity, for an autistic child not being able to have free access to those things, I can really imagine really impact their well-being, not just as a neurotypical person, but as an autistic person especially.
Yes. On the other hand, I think what a lot of other people don't realise is that sometimes in settled community and that rigidness of life can be overwhelming for autistic people. So actually nomadacy can be a real relief for autistic people to have like more space to sort of run around, have a less of a rigid life, sometimes can be like very good. Like I know for myself that when, you know, I'm able to get out and live a part of my like culture when I go and meet family, because my dad, he still travels around and I have family who live on sites, and it's really nice to have that kind of break from the rigidness of everyday life and everyday phone calls and everything else. And I'm sure settled people can understand that as well, because, you know, when you go on holiday and so for some autistic people, yes, being settled is maybe beneficial for them, but on the other hand, like living more of a nomadic lifestyle and living more of like a rural lifestyle can be really beneficial.
So maybe then challenging this idea that all, again, coming back to a problem of almost all autistic space, is this idea that we are all rigid, we all work one way, and we all need a certain set of support systems, where in fact, it sounds like a lot of the different communities are actually well equipped to support autistic people given the services. So I can imagine this is something that we all have common interests in, having services that are more freely available, more drop-in, that don't require huge long wait lists. For myself, I know I like quite a settled routine. I like having my small area, but also I live rurally and I have that space. I have that ability to go out into nature. I think also maybe looking at, instead of focusing purely on what does this community need and can we break it down to an equation, but maybe looking at how we engage and give the community the tools and the respect and the resources that it needs so that it can better care for its people.
Yes, and I totally agree with that. I mean, there is a lot of stereotypes that go on, I think, with both communities and not being understanding around disabilities. And don't get me wrong, there are things within, and I'm speaking from the experience of as a Romani, sometimes terminology isn't great, understanding of disabilities and disability rights, there's still a lot of way to go. But like a general feeling within the community is because we live culturally so different from settled people, it's more accepted. Like in my family, with me being autistic and my children being autistic, and there's loads of my family members who are autistic as well, and ADHD, there's a lot of neurodivergency in my family. And so for me being autistic, being as a kid, they were like, oh, well, you're just normal. Like almost neurodivergency in my family was normal. And they were like, we're all just a little bit strange. We're all just a little bit out there. So sometimes it's very difficult for people in those communities to guess that something else is going on until they go to education. And then once they go in education and hit the medical side of things, that's when they're told, oh, there's something wrong with this person. And they're told that it's a negative, it's a bad thing, and that they have to do something to cure them and to fix them. And that's when the negative tends to come in, I have found in my experience.
Yeah, and I suppose also there's the added complication of, is racism playing a part into this? Are you being cast as bad and not very social because you're part of, you're a Romney, you're a gypsy, you're a traveller, so that's the reason you're just going to perform badly at school because you're this ethnicity, rather than going, actually, they have a support need that is recognised in settled people, but somehow make a person a traveller or a Rom Nichelle or a Roma, and suddenly it's just a case of they're bad, throw them out.
Yeah, that's what happened to me in school. I wasn't diagnosed when I was a child. I've actually only in my 30s been diagnosed. So, yeah, it was a huge relief. So when I was younger and I started school, it's not that I didn't understand English or that spoke English, but like solely at home, we just spoke Romani. So when I went to school, there were things that I would say in our language that my teachers didn't really understand.
Yeah.
And even now, Romani isn't seen as a language that is accepted within the schools. So like other languages of the world, like people will understand that this person would need to learn English, whereas like Romani isn't really accepted that needs to happen. So when I went to school, a lot of my struggles were put down to that if I spoke or understood English better, then that would help me. If I speak English, the Queen's English, understand the Queen's English, even though I was born in England, so I understand English perfectly fine, and I speak English perfectly fine, then it was very much through my school life, it was put down very much to cultural. So when I would have a meltdown in school and smash up a classroom, that wasn't seen as a special educational need. That was seen as like, oh my God, she's Romani. They're badly behaved people. They don't discipline their children. They're rogues. That's what they do. They smash up things. They steal things. So when I was having a difficult time, and a lot of the time, especially when I was a kid, during my meltdowns, I would become quite violent. Like I wouldn't seek out people, but if you came towards me, like you were going to get a hit. Do you know what I mean? Where I grew up was, and my maiden name. So my maiden name is a very, very typical Romani Gypsy sort of last name. And my sort of lineage is very much like from prominent Romani families, if that makes sense. And the place that I grew up, it is a place that's history is associated with Romani Gypsies as well. I grew up on a council estate. Because of the amount of Romanis that lived on there, it was nicknamed Redskin Village, and a lot of people were terrified to actually go on. I think it's been described as a crime vortex. The connection for me growing up in that place with that history, everybody, regardless, there was no anonymity. I couldn't pretend to be from somewhere else or be something else. Everybody knew that I was Romani. And a lot of the schools that I went to had educated my dad, had educated my aunties and uncles, had educated my cousins. So like it was known. Because of that, when I walked into these schools, I was already labelled. There was already a label on me. So people couldn't look past that label to see actually that I had special needs. It's the same with my dad. So I now realize that my dad has undiagnosed ADHD. He hated school. So then he would bring his horse to school and tie it up on the goalpost in the field. And then obviously the teachers would be like, you know, you have to take the horse home. So he would sort of use that as an excuse because he couldn't cope with school. So obviously being his daughter, a lot of these teachers had already had dealt with my dad. So they were already like, yep, this is how it's going to be. I was actually diagnosed with dyslexia when I was in year 4. Although I didn't get any support for that throughout my school life. And I'm actually hearing impaired in both my ears. So that I've had since I was born. So they knew that. So I had no accommodation for my hearing loss and no accommodation for my dyslexia when I was at school. And I even had one teacher said to me, what's the point in educating you? You're just going to grow up and have children and cook and clean. That's all you're going to do. So it did come to a point where I was in high school. I would have 2 or 3 terms off of school, like going very, very rarely. And I was struggling. And then like culturally, like my mum wasn't really bothered. So therefore, my school wasn't bothered. You know, my school was like, oh, well, that's who she is and that's what they do. So, you know, we didn't have any absent teams or school ringing up to see how I was, anything that they could do. And I just about got my coursework in for my GCSEs, and I actually walked away with 5 A to C grade GCSEs, which is quite shocking. And I think to myself, if I was able to achieve that without the support and without the help and without accommodation, what could I have achieved with all of those things? The teachers would say, oh, Nikki is intelligent, she just needs to work harder, she needs to apply herself. And in my mum's own way, like my mum would sort of kick off of that notion and go, no, she isn't. She's not like that at all. Like she's struggling to do, you know what I mean? And my mum would be seen as aggressive, and a lot of the time, like, was just dismissed. And I don't think it's because my mum could really articulate what she was trying to get across in those sort of meetings. Even at the time that we had support from Traveller Education, which is a great resource, I think it's even for them, I think that they struggle to pick out special educational needs. So for me, being at school was extremely difficult, and I suppose that's why for me at this point as a parent I am so fierce in fighting for the support for my children, I suppose, because I empathize of what it's like to be at school with absolutely no support at all. I think that's what frustrates me, is that when it comes to education, by ethnicity, if I remember it rightly, the scores in English and maths receiving a level 5 or higher in GCSEs, 8.1 for Gypsies and Roma, and I'm not sure what was Irish Travellers.
Irish Travellers.
Yes. So for Romanese, it's 8.1, and then there is no special educational needs statistics for Gypsy and Roma. So if we're at 8.1% with neurotypical Roma, what are the likelihood for special educational needs Gypsy and Roma? It's likely to be a whole lot lower than that, to be honest.
And from what I can see from the data, the reason they discount it is purely by going, oh, there's not enough of them, which feels very dismissive.
It is. It's extremely insulting, because we have been in this country from at least the 1500s.
One of the things that I've often found, particularly in conversations with people who are, like myself, white and settled, there's often this kind of bemoaning, it's very modern, this very bemoaning lack of culture. And yet when you sit back and you go, actually, we've got a lot of culture. We just have segregated it off and said they're not part of our culture because they're the wrong kind of person, they're the wrong kind of life.
Yeah, I think especially for Romani people, we have always been othered. So we're never seen as part of this country, even though we have been in this country for centuries and a part of English culture. We're othered in this country. Like, there's so much of our culture, like take rural life, for instance. Like, we're a huge part of rural life we have just been like cut out and sliced.
One last thing, what could Neurodivergent Labour do for autistic traveller, Roma Shell, Romney Gypsy people?
So I would say, like, at the moment, Neurodivergent Labour is supporting some local protests and campaigns that the community are doing over the summer, from July until September, where in July we're going to be doing protests outside on Parliament Square to protest the new police reform bill, which within that is a trespass bill, which will make trespassing a criminal act rather than a civil matter, which will mean that the police can come and arrest you, can fine you, put you in prison, and take away your home, which is obviously, like I've said before, with the lack of sites, that literally puts people at risk of being left on the roadside homeless. So we're obviously fighting that trespass bill. I think a lot of settled people don't understand that this also affects them, because if you like to walk, if you're a rambler, if you have a mobile home, if you have an RV or anything like that, it can be...
Or a Morris dancer. The amount of trespass we've done is...
Yes, Exactly. So it can be as little as a toothbrush in your car. The police can say you're living in your car and remove your vehicle. So this is a huge, huge problem of taking away civil liberties. And the government is using Irish travellers and Romani gypsies as a scapegoat to get other people to give up their rights by saying they're going to deal with the vermin problem, which is us, and that it would only target us and stop us from camping on fields and leaving rubbish and all that sort of stereotype stuff. But it does affect everybody, and it is giving up civil liberties. So, you know, even if you're an Instagrammer who likes to travel around and live in your car for a week, it's going to affect you. So yeah, anybody who even owns a mobile van or anything like that, it's going to affect everybody. So we're going to be protesting in July at Parliament Square and trying to lobby MPs. And there'll be a series of events at Appleby Fair in August to the Tory conferences. There are going to be certain events that we're going to be protesting at to try and get this change and to stop the police reform bill, especially this trespass bill, which will hugely affect, especially those who are nomadic. For Neurodivergent Labour, I feel like the way that they can support is for the very first step of having me involved in accepting that we're a part of society. I mean, it'd be great if we could have somebody who represents also the Irish travellers, but yes, representing, like having somebody on board and realizing and accepting that we are an ethnicity, help to include GRT people in like manifestos and things like that, to include us into things that are going to like legislation to take place, to lobby with us, of course, and to just, you know, to be able to include us and have our voice be a part of Neurodivergent Labour is really, really important. Because it's nice to be included, and like you said, like the statistics, we're never seen as something that needs to be part of the statistics. So we have no idea how neurodivergencies, how many GRT people are neurodivergent. We're not in any studies, we don't know how many people in education are affected through special educational needs, how many have things like ECHPs. You know, we have no idea, and we're not even collected within the NHS directory. We're not even part of an ethnicity on there. So we don't have any statistics to back us up, despite the fact that we face huge barriers and huge discrimination in this country still. So it's fantastic to just have our voices heard and neurodivergent supporting our community and backing us up and being somebody who includes us and backs us up in things that we face. That's how I think like Neurodivergent Labour can help.
Full solidarity. That's what we need. Full solidarity.
Yes, exactly.
It's been an absolute pleasure having this discussion, and particularly with Kill the Bill. I know I've heard from mostly settled autistic people, particularly with a public nuisance, they're very afraid to go out into streets now in case they have a meltdown or they publicly behave in a weird way and then be targeted for police harassment. So in many respects, there is more similarities than there are differences, and I think that is ultimately the message, that as a settled person and as a Rom Nichelle, we can say we have more similarities than differences, and solidarity is what's going to bring us together.